Thank you, Hassan. Thanks to the Royal Institution for having me back. It's a real pleasure. It's an honor to be back in this august theater. Thank you all for choosing to come here. At least I hope no one had to be externally coerced to come, but maybe you were internally compelled to come. That's the question that we're after tonight. The problem of free will, which is an age-old question: are we really in control of our actions? Do we actually make decisions? Really? Is it really us who makes the decision? Are we in the driver's seat, or are we being taken for a ride? And this question has exercised theologians and philosophers and scientists for millennia. And it's interesting to think how different cultures have thought about it. Of course, in many ancient cultures, the idea was that actually we weren't in charge of anything. The fates, the gods, somehow directed our actions. We were just their playthings, really. In Christian religion, of course, this came up as a problem, the problem of evil, which St. Augustine solved. So the problem is, how could a good, all-knowing, all-powerful God allow evil to happen in the world? And St. Augustine's solution in the 300 whatever AD was that God had given us free will, and then whatever happened was up to us, was our fault. So, of course, the Calvinists didn't like that idea, so they sort of went back on that. So it's not really clear what Christianity says about free will at large. But what is important is that it's the foundation for moral responsibility. So when we're thinking about what other people have done and what we've done, the question of whether it's right to think of praising them or blaming them or rewarding or punishing them hangs on the question of, were they in control? Did they actually make a choice? Is it something that they can be held responsible for, both in a moral sense and in a legal sense? So this question then of how can we be in charge if everything we do is predestined by the fates or by an omnipotent God, morphed, as we learned more scientifically, into this scientific worry if material causes just fully determine what happens. How can we really be in control? And of course, Isaac Newton revealed a lawful world. His equations of motion allowed him to predict the orbits of the planets with amazing accuracy. And the implication was that everything really is like that. Everything in the world is like that. And it's all explained by material forces and causes and physical stuff that's moving around. So René Descartes, the French philosopher, had considered this question. If everything is just physical stuff, then how can what we're thinking have any kind of power over that stuff? How can a thought push stuff around? So he had the idea that there were two kinds of stuff in the world. There was physical stuff and mental stuff, these two realms of substance and existence, but in some way they could contact each other. Now, he was pretty vague about how, and in fact one of his correspondents, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, wrote to him and challenged him on this point. Okay, well, you've got mental stuff and physical stuff, but how do they interact with each other? He didn't have a good explanation for that, for how the mental stuff could actually intervene on the physical stuff. So we were left with a kind of a magic of an immaterial soul or a spirit that's doing things, but it seems hard to reconcile that view with a more scientific worldview. So that's the question I want to address tonight. Can we have free will without magic, but also at the same time without reducing ourselves to robots? Can we understand the mechanisms we use to make decisions without having to say it's the mechanisms that are making the decision, not us? That's what I'm after. And in modern times, there's a lot of challenges to the idea that we could be in charge as selves, as holistic entities and persons, as opposed to just material objects. And some of those come from my own field of behavioral genetics. And this is a book that I wrote a few years ago where it was laying out the very real evidence, I think, that we're not born as blank slates, that our genetics does give us some predispositions that manifest as our personality traits, which, of course, are really just patterns of behavior through time. So if we're wired a certain way, and we didn't choose that, then doesn't that mean we have at least less free will than we might have thought of? maybe no free will whatsoever. And some people would say, this sentence on the bottom here, that the configuration of our brain, which is the result of not just our genetics and our development, but all of our experiences up until any moment right now, our brain is configured a certain way, and that fully determines what we're going to do, where without us being really involved in that process anymore, we're just playing out our programming at every moment that we encounter. Now, that's not what I said, importantly. What I want to say is that, yes, of course, our genetics influences our personality and makes partly what makes us who we are as selves through time, but it doesn't close off any possibility for us to be actively involved in making a decision in real time, right now, in the moment. Now, there's another kind of a level where you can say, okay, you've got personality traits, you've got your psychology, your predispositions, and so on, but really all of that is just neural machinery. It's just a configuration of your brain, and if we go down to that level, well, we can see it's all just neurons firing. That's where the business is. That's where all the causal work is really happening. And this is a quote from Francis Crick, who was, you will know probably from Crick and Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA. He went on to become a very eminent neuroscientist. He was really interested in consciousness. But he had this view that really what you are is just this collection of nerve cells firing and all of the nerve processes going on and so on, where you kind of evaporate from that picture. It's just a very reductive kind of a view. It's all just neural circuits firing. And a lot of modern neurosciences tends to be reinforcing that view, because we can do these amazing experiments. We can look inside people's brains as they're making decisions, and we can see, oh, well, you know, you made that decision because this part of your brain was active, or that part. Or we can go into animals and we can activate the parts of the brain ourselves and make them make a decision. We can change not just what they do, but how they think about what they should do. So it seems like we're laying bare all this mechanism, and when we do that, there's nothing left. There's no person, there's no agent, there's no self left there. It's just machinery. And so one of the concerns then is that rather than neuroscience explaining how the brain gives rise to the mind, it's actually explaining away the mind. It's saying that all these things on the right there that we call psychology, mental states and goals and beliefs, the things that we would articulate as reasons for our doing things, actually just boil down to these neural activity patterns and brain states and circuit computations. They're nothing more than that. Now, if we're going down in levels from minds to brains, well, why stop? There's not really a principled place to stop until you hit rock bottom. And rock bottom here is just physics. I mean, after all those neurons are made of molecules and atoms. They have to obey the laws of physics. Just because they're in your brain doesn't mean they get a pass on all of the, you know, Newton's equations or quantum mechanics or whatever else it is. So some people would argue, like physicist Sean Carroll, for example, that those lowest levels of what we take to be reality, in this case of quantum fields and subatomic particles and so on, are causally comprehensive. And what he means by that is that the equations and principles that we know about in quantum mechanics fully explain what happens, and they don't allow or admit any other causes to be involved whatsoever. Now, I'll tell you, I think that's a mistake, but the argument is all the real causal work is just happening down at the lowest level. So not only can we reduce psychological states and cognition to just neural workings, we can reduce those to just atoms obeying deterministic laws. And the implication of that is pretty clear, as summed up here by Stephen Hawking. Because our decisions issue from the mechanics and dynamics of our brains, which themselves must issue from the dynamics of whatever quantum interactions and so on, then they must be as determined as the orbits of the planets. And it's not often I would stand in a public theater like this and say that Stephen Hawking was wrong, but he was. Wrong about that. So we have these kind of three levels of challenges, and I think it's important to distinguish them, this sort of psychological level, the neuroscience level, and then the base physics level. And I want to try and figure out how we can address those, because this is a problem not just for human free will, it's a problem for biology, it's a problem for explaining how any organism could be said to be doing anything, right? Can be acting in the world, can be an agent, can be a locus of causal power, a new kind of thing in the universe, not just not subject to all the causes of everything else, but a cause by itself in the world. And that is a fundamental property of living things. And if we want to understand it, then these dictums here are a good guide to how to do that. At least I think so. That for any biological thing, if we take an evolutionary approach to it, we may understand it better by understanding how it came to be that way. And that's the approach that I've taken in the book, and it's the approach I want to lay out tonight. So the idea is that we can delay somewhat tackling these metaphysical questions by actually, rather than saying, well, how could this work in principle, let's look in practice. How did it actually work? How did evolution make these organisms that seem to be able to act and decide what to do in the world? So for me, that's a really important question. It's not just a kind of an academic exercise of do we have free will or not, the kind of thing you talk about in the pub over a few pints, right? It's very, very fundamental to many aspects, including clinically important ones, like what does it mean to be a self? What are disorders of selfhood? Things like schizophrenia and dementia and so on, where the self somehow dissolves or dissociates. How does that relate to disorders of control, where like OCD or drug addiction or things like that? We need to have a science of these kinds of conditions that allows us to see the mechanisms without the person disappearing, without the self disappearing. And I think that we can. I think that we can do that. It's also very interesting and relevant these days in thinking about artificial intelligence and artificial life and artificial agency. Maybe to make an artificial general intelligence, you might have to make an intelligence, an agent that can interact in the world. I'm not saying that we should. I'm just saying that that might be what's required to get us to that point. More fundamentally, I think just in terms of biology and the way that we think about living things, agency is absolutely crucial to what living things are. And it's not often talked about. If you look in any biology textbook at the characteristics of life, you'll see things like respiration and metabolism and maybe movement and homeostasis. You won't see agency. The fact that living things can act in the world is so fundamental, but it doesn't feature that much in our science of biology. I'm going to tell you some reasons why that is. So really where I want to start is actually what does it mean to be a living thing at all? Because that distinguishing characteristic of agency is what distinguishes them from non-living stuff. So Erwin Schrödinger in 1943 gave a series of lectures in Trinity College, Dublin, where I work, called What is Life? And he was a famous physicist, and he took a physicist's view on living things. And in particular, what he was interested in was how do these living things stay organized? Right? They're organized sets of processes that are keeping themselves that way, even though the second law of thermodynamics says that everything should just kind of go to equilibrium, should just get more disordered. So these things are doing some work to stay ordered and to persist through time. That's really what it means to be a living thing. And so I've drawn this little schematic here. It's like a single-celled organism, like a little bacterium. And inside it, there's all these metabolic processes going on. That's the living stuff. That pattern of processes is what makes it what it is. And it's trying to allow that pattern to persist through time. In order to do that, it has to expend energy. And it has to take in food from the environment to keep that going. So it's a big, holistically integrated pattern of activity. That's what a living thing is. And it's trying to persist through time. Now, the problem is the world doesn't cooperate. Right? The world is changing all the time, which means that the organism, in order to persist, has to also adapt. It has to change in real time, not just in evolutionary time. So what that means is that it becomes useful for that organism to know what's going on outside it. So it has this nice bubble around it that insulates it from everything else in the world. It stops it from just going to equilibrium, becoming one with the universe. But that's a barrier as well. It's a barrier for physical causes. But the organism wants to know, it needs to get information about what's out in the world. So single-celled organisms use these little antennae which are sticking out of the cell. Those are just protein molecules which act as receptors for things out in the world. So they can bind some chemicals out in the world, and then they convey that information into the cell. So what an organism needs in order to survive is to know what's out in the world and what should I do about it. It needs to mount an adaptive, appropriate response that's going to help it persist for longer. And that's exactly what bacteria do. So I've added here an important part, which is a motor. So this is a structure called a flagellum, a long sort of a filament. It's like an outboard motor, like a propeller, and it allows the bacteria to move around. And what they want to do, well, first of all, they want to stay alive. Okay, so now we have something that never existed in the universe before. We have purpose. Not like a cosmic teleology, just a purpose for a living thing to persist through time, which means that actions that favor its persistence and organizations that allow those actions will be favored because they persist. So that kind of purpose, I think, is key. It's a word that is kind of often banished from polite scientific discourse as if it's mystical. I don't think it has to be. I think we can just ground it in this very prosaic kind of drive to keep going. Now, in order to persist, it wants information about what's out in the world. And here we've got a kind of causation that doesn't exist anywhere else. Right? So when this bacterium, say, binds a sugar molecule out in the world, something that it can eat, that it wants to go towards, it's not being pushed, it's not being pulled by any physical forces. There's just a conveyance of information across the membrane of the cell. So the outside binds a molecule of sugar, and the inside gives a little wiggle and says, hey, I just bound a molecule of sugar. And then the bacterium mounts the appropriate response, which is to move towards it. And of course, it may encounter things that it wants to move away from as well. So it's got some control policies wired into its biochemical engineering that allows it to do these things. Now, the other word that's really important here is, well, first of all, that these things have value. The signals have value because the thing is trying to persist. But secondly, that they have meaning. And the meaning in this case is wrapped up in that adaptive response. It's wrapped up in the question, what should I do about it? It's not there, the bacteria is not separately apprehending. It's not saying, oh, there's a sugar out there, I should do something about it. It's just directly coupled to the action response. Okay? So you can think about this kind of a pragmatic meaning to the signal. So here we have a signal, and on the top line there, the signal to action. So if A is the case, then do X. That's the policy that's configured in the biochemistry of the bacterium. And really, it's more complicated than that. It integrates multiple things at once, as I'll show you. So bacteria have two ways of moving around. Now, you may be wondering in a talk on free will why I'm spending so much time on bacteria. It'll be clear, I hope. There are some concepts that we can ground, that we need, that we can ground here that are going to be at play in our decision-making as well. They move around in two ways. They can swim in a direct line, or they can kind of tumble around and just change direction and then set off in a different way. Now, when they detect a gradient of a molecule, as shown on the bottom here, they just spend more time swimming towards it, and that's determined by which direction their flagellum is rotating. It's an amazing machine, actually. So you can think about this. It's been really, really well studied and well worked out. So here's our little bacterium. It's got a protein, the black thing there, that can bind a sugar. And when it does that, it sends a signal inside the cell, which is relayed through a couple of other proteins to affect the way the flagellum is moving. Okay? A nice mechanism, like a reflex, like an isolated kind of a thing. And when you look at it like that, it gives the impression that the bacterium is not doing anything. It's just the site where stuff is happening, and it's being pushed around by its own parts. So it's just configured in that way and has no sort of, it's not actively involved in a decision, it's just kind of a mechanistic reflex. And I want to argue that even in this simplest kind of behavior that we know about, really, that's already a mistake to think in that way. Because when we do these experiments in the lab, of course, what we do is we control the environment completely. Right? So we have a bacterium swimming around. There's nothing in the environment except some sugar over here. Right? So we're just confronting it with one nice, isolated little signal at a time. Now, nature is not so obliging. in the real world, what the bacterium has to do and deal with is this incredibly complex, dynamic ecosystem, all these other kinds of bacteria, all sorts of changes and dynamics happening that it has to navigate all at once. And so what the full kind of a pathway, and this is even still just a little sketch of it, looks more like this, where actually the bacterium is not just responding to X, it's sensitive to X and Y and Z out in the world and lots of other things besides. Its response is dependent on its own state. So its own nutrient state will determine what its response is. It's not just an automatic kind of a thing. And it's dependent on things like context of how many other cells are around, what the temperature is, all sorts of other factors are going in to allow the thing to make a holistic decision. And crucially, it's bringing its own recent history to bear on that, because the way that it knows that it's going up a gradient is it compares the level of signal right now to the level a second ago or a couple of seconds ago. So it's doing a temporal kind of an integration. So it's really a holistic exercise that allows the organism as a whole thing to figure out what to do. Now, there's one other factor here that's really key, and it's much more sophisticated than you would expect for a simple organism like this. So they have this first-order set of machinery that allows them to integrate all this information. Okay? But it has the settings of that machinery are not fixed. In fact, the organism can adapt and habituate to different changing signals by altering how much of these different proteins it makes. So there's a second-order level of regulation where it allows the organism to govern its own policies of what to do and use that context to change things. We're going to see when we talk about nervous systems that we have exactly the same kind of a thing. We've got some slow control systems that provide context for the fast control systems. And the slow ones include things like what are our goals, what are we trying to do over long extended periods of time, and they contextualize our sort of immediate momentary decision making. So what I want to argue is that even there, in this really, really simple example, there's already an exercise of a kind of agency, at least a proto-agency, where the bacterium is not just being pushed around by things physically, it's taking in information, it's integrating that information based on its own state, based on what's out in the world, and it's coming to a holistic decision about what to do in a way that fits with how it's managing its own behavior and physiology through time. Now, what I'm arguing there is that the information has some meaning for the organism, and that the meaning is what's important in that system. But this is a hard kind of argument to sustain if we go back to one of these challenges to free will, which is this question of physical determinism. I mean, what am I even talking about? Meaning. What could that possibly mean in a system where there's just atoms and molecules and subatomic particles bouncing around, being controlled by the laws of physics? How can meaning have any causal power in a system like that? So one way to think about this in physical terms is that the state of a system, right now, if we knew the state of all the atoms in this room, and we could completely describe that, plus the laws of physics, would completely determine the next state. And the next state. And the next, and the next, and the next forever. Right? So the implication of that is there's only one timeline ever. There's no branching, there's no possibilities, there's no options or choices open to anything. There's just what's going to happen, one physical timeline. So if physical determinism really holds in that full sense, then since the Big Bang, the moment of the Big Bang, to me saying this sentence and you hearing it, all of that was completely determined. So everything I'm saying right now, somehow the information about it was contained at the moment of the Big Bang. Now, that's an astonishing, extraordinary claim to make, but it is the logical inference to draw if that idea that all of the physics is really, really deterministic is true. And I don't think there's extraordinary evidence to support that extraordinary claim, even though many people just sort of assume that physics really is deterministic. So this question goes back, or this argument goes back thousands of years. The ancient Greek atomists like Democritus, who proposed amazingly that the world is made of atoms, things that couldn't be divided any further, He also argued that the lines that those atoms follow through time are completely fixed. There's no deviation from what they're going to do. Now, Epicurus, who came along a little while afterwards, realized that if that were true, then it would mean free will couldn't possibly exist. There would be no way that you could make a choice if the atoms that make you up are just going to do what they're going to do. So he proposed this rather poetic term that they must swerve sometimes. There must be a little bit of freedom. Now, he wasn't arguing that it's the swerving that causes what you do. He was saying that the swerving just loosens the treaties of fate. It loosens things up a little bit and allows for you to be in charge because the causation is not exhausted by everything down at the lowest level. And I think he was dead right. So this question, does determinism hold? Does physics actually say that if you know the state of a system at time t, plus the laws of physics, it completely determines the state at time t plus 1, t plus 2, and so on? Well, no, it doesn't. So Newton, when he was calculating the orbits of the planets, you could get that impression from that. It happens that the orbits of the planets are particularly obliging in that regard. They're very simple, and they actually are really predictable and deterministic. But most things in the world are not like that. And of course, when quantum physics came along, it threw a spanner in the works entirely. So in quantum physics, first of all, it's not possible to define the state of a system with infinite precision at one time. And the equations that govern the way that these systems evolve are also not fully deterministic. So those two things refer to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says that the position and momentum of a particle can't exist with infinite precision at the same time. It's not a question about whether we can know it. They mathematically relate in such a way that they can't be both precise at the same time. And the Schrödinger equation, which again is Schrödinger again, which says how quantum systems will evolve through time, is not actually saying what will actually happen. It's giving a probability distribution of what could happen. What actually happens when you look at it, when the system collapses, is that one of those things will emerge, and in any given run, it's random. It's really random. There's nothing else causing it, and it doesn't really depend on an observer, just an interaction. Now, many people would say, okay, look, please, don't be that guy. Don't be that guy who leans on weirdness of quantum physics to explain another weird thing like free will. Okay, so I won't be. Because actually, the idea that, well, okay, maybe quantum physics is indeterministic, but that doesn't mean that when we get up to the level of things like us, that classical physics, the idea is that that's really deterministic, and it's a separate sort of a thing. So no, it's not right. That's not deterministic. We have exactly the same problems at the classical level for different reasons, partly because of what's going on at quantum levels, but partly just because it's still impossible to define the state of a system with infinite precision. And the reason for that is that information is physical. It takes some physical space and form to actually encode information. So given that the universe is finite, then the idea that you could have information about every possible future state forever, which would be infinite, packed into the universe at any time point, especially the first one, just mathematically doesn't work, physically doesn't work. We know from what's called the Bekenstein bound, there's just a limit to how much information you can fit into a defined physical space. And that's especially true because the universe at the start, down here at the moment of Big Bang, was tiny. And as the universe is expanding, it's not just that new states are happening. There's new possibility spaces are being opened up. So there couldn't be information about the state of a universe where the possibilities didn't even exist at the time of the Big Bang. So classical physics, I would say, is not deterministic, despite what you might think. And this is just a couple of quotes from physicists and philosophers making that point, that actually it's an assumption. It's an idealization of a lot of physics. It's not a result of physics. Now, how does that help? What it means is physical systems left to their own devices will be indeterministic. The state of a system at time t will give a set of possibilities of what could happen at the next time, and a wider set of possibilities the further you go into the future. Like the state of the weather now kind of constrains pretty tightly what the state of the weather will be 5 minutes from now, and an hour and a day from now, but not at all a year from now. Okay, how does that help? It doesn't help in the sense that, well, there's an argument which I call the either way you're screwed argument. So this goes like this. Either physics is deterministic and your choices are not up to you, or physics is indeterministic and your choices are not up to you because it's just random stuff happening. Right? So, and what I want to say is that there's a third option here, which is that the indeterminacy opens up a little room for organisms, for organized systems, to have some causal power at a macro scale. Okay. So if we start with the premise of indeterminism, it flips the script in this debate. We don't have to ask, where could this freedom come from that organisms are supposed to have in a deterministic world? The freedom just comes for free. It's just in the universe. But now we have to ask a different question. Where does the control come from? If you're an organism faced with a future in which many things might happen, your job now is to have systems that allow you to control what does happen, right? To make happen what you want to happen out of this big possibility space. And the important thing is that the indeterminacy, which raises the challenge, also provides an opening for the solution. So the indeterminacy doesn't settle the outcome, but what it does, as Epicurus said, is loosen the treaties of fate. It means all the causation is not down at the bottom. We can have systems that are organized, where the way they're organized has some causal efficacy in determining what happens. And that's been really nicely articulated by philosopher Alicia Huerero, where she really points out that you can have constraints that act as causes. It's just not the case that the only real causes are physical forces that are pushing things around. The way things are organized can do functional work. That's why this computer is working the way it is. It's not changing the laws of physics affecting the electrons in there, but it is constraining how they move to support a function. And we're like that too. Living things are organized in the same way as you saw in the bacterium. So the configuration of living systems has been selected to ensure their persistence. And that means we have lots of different functional systems to get information about what's out in the world, to integrate that information with our current states, our needs, and then figure out what to do about it. Now, I've been talking so far about unicellular organisms that do this with biochemistry. But when we got multicellular organisms, collections of cells that now make things with limbs and different body parts and so on, well, they had to reinvent these kind of control systems, but on a body-wide basis. And the nervous system is exactly what that is, what meets that challenge. So nervous systems evolved very early on in animal evolution. So things like sponges don't have them, but as soon as we get to jellyfish and so on, they have a kind of a nervous system which is there to help them coordinate their body. So that's the first job of the nervous system as a control system, is that it allows an organism with multiple parts to do different things, right, by coordinating them. So this creature is called a hydra, it's a little marine polyp, which sits in this little thing with its body, and it has these tentacles that grab food and so on. It can do a few basic movements, which are shown here. It kind of contract, it can roll on it, it can do little somersaults and things, depending on what's out in the world. Okay. So its nervous system is there to coordinate its movements and to link them to its sensory information about what's out in the world and make adaptive kinds of choices. Now, it's a very simple nervous system. What it doesn't have is a brain. Brains came along later. Brains give you some extra levels of control. So this is a nematode worm, a tiny microscopic worm, lives in the soil, and it has lots of neurons throughout its body, those little black dots. It has exactly 302 neurons in its body, and some of those are sensory neurons, so they're detecting what's out in the world. Some of them are motor neurons. They're controlling its muscles and executing different kinds of actions. And then in between, the real business is this layer of red neurons. So what we have here is a diagram that shows these little pink triangles are sensory neurons, and it's a circuit diagram that shows how they're connected to a layer of interneurons that are between the sensors and the motors. And the motor neurons, these purpley ones, will execute different behaviors. So just like the hydra or the bacterium, the first thing is that there's a repertoire of actions that this creature can do. Pretty simple in this case. Pretty much move forward, move backwards, or mate with something. That's about all these things do. So what's important is that the creature can integrate information in this internal layer, right? It's got some internal layer of cognition that's separating and decoupling sensation from action. What has happened over evolution is that that space just got bigger and bigger and bigger. You added more and more levels in there, and you get greater and greater cognitive depth. So what's interesting, if you think about worms, if they're thinking, they're not thinking about much because they don't sense very much. They only have touch and smell. And both of those things are only responding to things that are right in the immediate environment of the worm. Okay? Because for smell, it has to actually physically bind the thing that it's interested in. Right? So what that means is that the worm is living in the here and now. It's not planning anything in the future because it can't see anything in the future. That changed when we got the evolution of long-range senses. So vision and hearing, especially when creatures move to the land. In the water, vision and hearing are both attenuated by the medium, but in air, both sound waves and especially light, well, you can see for miles. You can see things coming a mile away. Now it pays off to have some cognitive apparatus that allows you to think about things that are further into the future, to plan for things and actions that will only pay off further into the future. So as organisms got to become a little more complicated, they developed this cognitive apparatus at the same time. These systems kind of co-evolved. Now, what's interesting is that organisms, what they're sensing is photons hitting a retina or air vibrations hitting their cochlea. Right? They don't care about photons hitting their retina. They're not interested in that. That's not adaptive information. What they care about is what did they bounce off of in the world before they hit my retina. Right? So now they have to do a job. They're not directly interacting with the things, the objects of interest, like a worm smelling something. They have to infer what were the causes of my sensory data. And that involves a whole load of processing. Because these organisms now, especially when we got to things like the Cambrian explosion and the emergence of predators who are trying to eat you, or things that you are trying to eat, it led to this kind of arms race of increased perceptual skills and the cognitive apparatus that went along with that. So the challenge for an organism then, in terms of visual perception, is parsing the world into different objects. So this is what self-driving cars have to do. So they have to be able to take incoming information in their cameras and then parse what's a car, what's a bus, what's a traffic light, what's the road, what's a pedestrian, and so on, and take appropriate action. Well, organisms have to do the same thing. And the way that they do that is by processing information through these different layers, these extra internal layers of the nervous system. So you could imagine a situation like this on the left, where you're going from one neuron to the next. That's no use, right? That's terrible. You're just losing information because those are noisy channels. Instead, what happens is you go from one level to the next, where as you go up each level, the neurons at one level integrate information from multiple neurons below. So now they know something that the individual elements down there don't know. They know what the pattern is. And we start to see that kind of abstraction of features and objects in the world already right in the retina. So we've got photoreceptors that are responding to light, but they don't know what the other photoreceptors are responding to. But that information is channeled through the circuitry to these retinal ganglion cells, which are the output cells. Those are the ones that make up the optic nerve, send information to the brain. They're already doing a ton of integration that allows them to respond selectively, particularly to the edges of things, to contrast. That's what they're interested in. In fact, they enhance the contrast in the image information before they send it to the brain. Because the edges of things could be the edges of objects. That's what we care about. Now that information makes its way to the back of the brain, to the primary visual cortex, but then there's a load of more levels internally, and at each level, you have more and more integration of higher order features in the data. So what these different parts of the brain are interested in is things like edges, lines of certain orientation, or shapes or objects. Eventually you get to areas of the brain, like the one shown there for where the face is pointing, that are really, really selective and that only become active when there's a face out in the world, in the visual scene. And what that means now is that the activity of those neurons is a representation inside to the rest of the brain. It says, hey, there's a face out there. Right? It's totally decoupled now from action. It's not the same kind of meaning that we had in a simple bacterium. It's an internalized kind of a meaning, which rather than saying if A, do X, it's if A, then report A to a kind of a central cognitive machinery or economy that can now integrate over all this different information and then ultimately figure out what to do. So unlike a thermostat, which just acts when the temperature changes, this is more like a thermometer that's reporting that the temperature has changed. That's information that you can use cognitively. So we've moved from the situation on the top where we had this pragmatic coupling between sensors and actors to a stage where we've decoupled those progressively. And now we've got more and more internal stages where the thinking can go on, really, really cognition about what to do. Now, one of the key elements here, and another big payoff of having a nervous system, is that nervous systems allow organisms to learn. And as individuals, to figure out what their policies should be based on their own individual experience, not just evolutionary experience, which is what configures bacteria. So the way that we do that is to link to prior knowledge. So when we're doing perception, we're not neutral in that process. We're actively trying to recognize, trying to interpret what it is that's out in the world, and we're using all our knowledge of the world to do that, right, to make sense of the data that we get. So organisms acquire these rich causal models of the world, a knowledge base of things that are in the world by interacting with it, the way that babies interact with things in the world, right? They're trying to figure out not just what's there, but what can I do with it? They pick up some object. Can I pick it up? It's the type of thing I can put in my mouth. Does it taste good? Can I eat this? Will it hurt me? Is this thing living? Does that thing feed me? That's what organisms need. That's how babies calibrate these kinds of senses. And of course, we continue to do that throughout our lives. So the dynamics of neural plasticity allow an encoding of these kinds of memories and this kind of a knowledge base. And in a couple of ways that are really important. So the first is this question of what are the properties of objects? Right? I recognize this, and I know what I can do about it, with it, or about it, whatever. That's the kind of information that organisms need, is what are the affordances? This affords me picking up. The liquid affords me drinking it. Okay? It allows me to do that. That's what organisms need to do. So they build up this web of the properties of objects, how they relate to each other, how they causally intervene on each other, or what they can do, and those affordances, which are already baked into perception. It's very action-oriented already. It's not a neutral kind of a thing. It's very much, what do I need to know, and how can I get that information? The other aspect of learning is crucial here, because it relates to action, the action that an organism takes in any given scenario. So here's an organism comes along, recognizes some kind of a scenario, and then takes an action. But it pays attention to what happens. It pays attention to whether that action turned out well or badly, and then that lets it recalibrate a little bit. It lets it learn a little bit. The next time it encounters that scenario, it may say, well, I did A the last time, that turned out terribly, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to do B instead. So over time, what happens is that we get a better understanding of how to navigate through the world based on this increasing knowledge, where really the knowledge is power. It increases the autonomy of the agent because it gives it more control over what will happen. It gives it better predictive power of what will happen if it does A, B, C, or D. So it's building up this model of the world, it's building up a model of itself and the interactions between those things to give it the greatest kind of purchase on the future actually, on making the future what it wants to be. And over time, we build up this knowledge in our own minds, where we go from percepts, seeing things out in the world, hearing things and so on, to much more abstract concepts that we can operate over. So, for example, if I showed you a picture of a dog, it would activate the concept of dog, and you could think about dogs. If I just say the word dog, it just happened. You all did it again, right? You just activated the concept. It's removed from the particularities of the presentation. Now you have this abstract idea that you can work with, you can think with, you can really do cognition over. Those are the objects of cognition. That's what we're thinking about. We're not thinking about all the low-level neural processing. That's actively excluded from the more higher-level parts of cognition, especially conscious cognition. What consciousness really is a filter that's keeping out all that stuff. We don't want to think about that. We just want to think about what are the objects in the world, what do I know about them, and so on. So what we can see in any sort of situation is we have this sort of loop happening all the time, through time. An organism assesses a situation in the round, not just reacting to individual things most of the time, and it assesses its own internal state. What are my drives? What are my goals? What's my fuel levels? Am I hungry or thirsty? Do I have longer-term, more sophisticated goals that we see in humans? And then there's a sort of suggestion. Well, what could I do in this scenario? Now, in some circumstances, it may be so habitual, such a familiar kind of scenario, that you know exactly what to do. You don't have to spend any time thinking about it. You've done all the work, and you've baked that into these policies. You can just use that and do a habit, and usually it turns out well. But in other scenarios, it may be quite novel. You may have to think a little bit about what it is that you should do. And one of the great inventions of the nervous system is this internal ability to simulate what would happen in the scenario if I do A, B, or C? And what are the likely outcomes, and how useful would those outcomes be? And those can be tested internally in a kind of a competition for who gets to be the action that gets done, right? And that evaluation can be biased by learning. So that's how habits come to be the only one that even gets thought of in some cases. So that internal simulation is really important because it allows an organism to think through possibilities of what could happen without having to actually do it in the world and risk its life potentially. At some point, that competition will be resolved. One of those actions will be selected, and all the others will be inhibited. Right? Just like in a worm or a bacterium, there's a repertoire of possible actions, and it has to do only one. That's why we have cognition, because we can only do one thing at a time. As that action is completed, then there's an assessment that says, well, okay, how am I doing? Am I reaching my goal? How did that turn out for me? And then that feeds into the learning, which feeds back and makes the model richer and allows greater control through time. So it's the through time bit that I think is really important. A lot of the discussion in free will, in the philosophical literature, and actually a lot of the experimentation on decision-making and action selection in neuroscience is set up in a way where there's a kind of a binary decision. It's a really simple scenario. The rat has to go left or right. The person has to say they saw a face or a house. In free will, well, there's all kinds of arcane scenarios, but they're usually binary, instantaneous decisions. Now, most of our behavior is not like that. We're guiding our behavior through time because we are planning for the future. And in order to achieve something, we can't just decide to do it and then expect it to just happen. We have to sustain activity towards a goal through time. So as we select a goal, we're actually constraining and informing our future momentary decision-making to allow us to achieve those kinds of things through time. So really what we do is integrate that information in the context of what we're already doing, right? What were our activities? What were the plans and goals that we have in line already? How should we accommodate those and prioritize different things given the new information that we have? Now, one of the interesting counter-arguments to this is that actually at any moment, your goals and your intentions are just set by everything that went on before, and really you don't know anything about them and you can't really think about them, and they're actually opaque to you. So this is advanced by Sam Harris, for example, who asked, how can we be free if everything that we intend was just the result of things going on in our brain and prior causes that we had no control over? Now, I hope already some of you may be seeing that I would be saying, well, we did have some control over it. We had lots of control over our intentions and so on. But he would argue that we don't know where our thoughts or intentions come from. They just bubble up to consciousness. And we don't have any power over them, and we can't choose them. Now, I just think that's plain wrong. I think we choose our goals and intentions all the time. And when we do that, those goals then inform what happens later. So if I choose to play a round of golf, I'm going to have the intention of putting this stupid little ball in the stupid little hole. That's the point, right? I chose that. That's where that intention came from my prior self, extended through time to allow me to achieve something that's an activity that takes time. So I just think it's a mistake to think that we don't know where our goals come from. We're constantly choosing goals. We're not just choosing actions. We're choosing goals, we're choosing activities, we're choosing behaviors, and then we're choosing the actions that will accomplish those behaviors. So this kind of nested series or levels of decision-making that allow us to coordinate our own behavior through time in a very proactive way, not just reacting to stimuli as they pop up in the world. We accommodate to new information, but it's not pushing us around. We're doing what we're doing. So we're optimizing over multiple goals. Now, in the story of evolution, which I've skipped over millennia here, when we get on the human lineage, what happens especially is that some parts of the brain really, really expanded, and those include the parts of the brain at the front called the prefrontal cortex. Those are the elements where when you look for neural activity that correlates with a person holding one goal versus another, that's where you see the patterns that match that. Right? So that's where goals are chosen. That's the bits that we need for planning, for what's called executive function. So monitoring what we're doing, seeing how are we achieving our goals, switching between tasks if new information comes to light, and so on. Those are the kinds of things, if you get injuries to prefrontal cortex, that people have deficiencies in that kind of planning, deficiencies in impulse control, in delaying gratification, and promoting long-term goals over short-term goals, and so on. So what I want to argue then is that what happens is really up to us, that actually cognition is really real. It can't be reduced to just neural firings. We do have beliefs and desires and intentions, and those are the things that we can think about that allow us to guide our behavior. Now, I want to make one final point about that, because I think it's still possible to say, okay, you're talking about beliefs and desires, that's all nice, but isn't it the case that at any moment those beliefs and desires have some neural instantiation? Won't they be really still some kind of a pattern of neural firing? And they will. But it's not the pattern, it's not the detailed pattern that's important, it's the meaning of the pattern that's important. That's what the system is configured to pay attention to and to be causally sensitive to. And I want to give you just a little example of that. So here's a neuron that's firing. You know, we tend to think of the nervous system working like this, where we've got this neuron here, maybe active, sends an electrical signal, and then it impinges on this one and it pushes it, right? It drives it electrically. I think that's a sort of an idea that we get from thinking about simple reflex circuits. I want to say that the causation in the nervous system is completely the opposite. The active element is the receiver here. That neuron, much like any single cell, is trying to figure out what's going on in the world and what should I do about it. Right? And the way that it's doing that is taking in information from lots of different other neurons, but it doesn't know anything about them. It just has neurotransmitter signal that it's getting, some amount through some time. And then it makes a kind of an integration about what it should do. And the criteria for what it should do are set here in these synaptic connections. Those are the bits that change when we're learning something. What's happening is we're changing the criteria of information flow within the network, right? We're instantiating meaning right into the anatomy of the nervous system. So if we think about whether the causes of our behavior are the cognitive meaning of the patterns or the neural instantiations, then I think we can ask an important question. If we assume that something is the cause of something else, so A is the cause of X happening, then it seems logical to say, well, if A wasn't the case, then X shouldn't happen, right? Otherwise, A is not the cause. So when you look at the nervous system, what we see is that actually you can change a lot of the details of the neural firing without changing what happens, if you keep the meaning of the macro state the same. And let me give you just an example of that. Well, here's a commonplace example. So what's different here, we got lots of details that are varying between these presentations of all of the A's and all of the B's, right? But you still recognize them as A or B. That's what you care about when you're reading. It doesn't matter what font something's written in, whether it's italics or bold or so on. Well, the same kind of principle applies when neurons are talking to each other. They don't care if it's in italics or bold. They care if it means A or it means B. And we can see that in modern neuroscience by monitoring the activity of not just single neurons, but populations of neurons, which is how bits of brain talk to each other. So here's an example where here's a population of neuron that's monitoring its inputs. So the inputs are coming from here, but this is the one that's doing the work. And what it's doing is trying to determine what does the pattern of firing here, which could be, each of these is supposed to be like a little neuron that's active or not active. You could have a bunch of patterns that all correspond to A and a bunch of different patterns that correspond to B. And what matters is whether they mean A or B. It doesn't matter which of the detailed things are there. So the neural instantiation is required, of course, but it's arbitrary. It's sort of incidental. What matters in the system is what those things mean. So I think rather than thinking that we can do away with psychology and reduce it to the neural level, or even indeed to the physical level, I would say exactly the opposite. If we want to understand how the brain is working and how it gives rise to the mind and cognition, then we have to recognize that actually those neural activity patterns and brain states and so on only have causal efficacy in the system by virtue of what they mean. This system runs on meaningful states and meaningful patterns. And that gets me to this last point about mental causation. So this comes back to Descartes and Elizabeth of Bohemia, who had a very wise kind of insight about Descartes' problem of dualism, where we had separate mental stuff and physical stuff. So if that's the case, here on your left, imagine you've got some neural state here, and it's giving rise to a thought. Okay, so it entails some kind of mental experience. But then how does that mental experience, how does the content of that feed back down into the brain if they're completely separate kinds of stuff? That was Descartes' problem. He never solved it because there isn't a solution to it. An alternative is to think, actually, yeah, maybe that pattern gives rise to a thought, but the thought's not doing anything. The meaning of that thought has no power. It's just one neural activity firing another neural activity, right? So that's reducing away the mind and eliminating it and saying it's just all neuroscience. What I want to argue for is what I call cognitive realism, just that cognition is a real thing, that you thinking about stuff has causal power in your own physical brain because your thoughts are physical patterns of neural activity. But they're not just any pattern. They're patterns that mean something, and it's the meaning of the activity that is going to have an influence over what happens in the nervous system. The final element in our evolution, which I think really sets us apart, and which really justifies the use of the term free will in humans, as opposed to just agency, is that we have an extra ability. We're not just thinking about stuff in the world. We're not just operating over sets of beliefs and sets of desires and so on. We have an extra level that lets us think about those thoughts, this level of metacognition. So we can, in a sense, the highest parts of the cortical hierarchy can look down at the operation of the mind itself. We're not just modeling the world, modeling or the self in terms of our body, we're modeling the activities of our own minds. And that's a really, really powerful part of a control system, because it allows you to do things like test your beliefs for consistency, right? So you may believe A and you may believe B, but should you believe both of those things at the same time? Maybe they're incoherent. It allows us to ask how certain we should be about something, which is really useful if we're guiding behavior, because, you know, some part of your brain may say, I believe there's a face out there, or I believe there's a tiger in the bushes, right? But maybe it was just the wind. So how certain should we be of different kinds of a signal? That's a really, really useful information to have. That's what metacognition gives us. It's the ability to think about our own thoughts, to reason about our own reasons, and crucially, to tell other people about them. Because the story of human evolution doesn't end with this biological emergence of Homo sapiens, right? It continues through cultural evolution. And that cultural evolution depends on the ability that we can reason together, that we can tell each other why we did something or why we should do something, and we can argue, persuade, we can cooperate, and so on. So those kinds of processes are exactly the thing that really set us apart, that I think allowed us to transcend the immediacies of our own individual agency and act collectively in the world. So to sum up then, what I hoped to do was to naturalize the idea of free will so that we're not stuck between magic on the one hand and reductive neuroscience or physics on the other. So I would say that free will is an evolved biological capacity, or really a suite of capacities, that gives us the ability to direct our future within degrees of freedom. Right? Not absolute freedom, of course there isn't. We are constrained by our past. We are constrained by who we are and our personality and all of the evolution that has led us to this point and our past experience, which is what we remember about the world. What would we be otherwise? Right? To think that we would be completely free, you wouldn't be you. There'd be no you left if you didn't have any memories, if you didn't have any goals, if you didn't have any future desired states. All of those are prior causes that are influencing behavior. So any organism is bringing its whole history to bear on the present moment in the service of its future self. Self only makes sense as something that has continuity through time, not this momentary, instantaneous kind of thing. So we have degrees of freedom. We have developed these systems to integrate information about what's in the world, and then we really do think about it. We really do reason about what we should do, and what we should do really is up to us. More in some circumstances than others, more for some people than others, more for adults than for babies, more for people with healthy brains than people with schizophrenia or drug addiction or dementia and so on. And it's important that we have a science that allows us to think about those things in practical terms, but also ones that don't eliminate the person from our discussion of what's going on. So I will leave it there, and thank you so much for your attention. I'll be delighted to take some questions.